This is Japan's most insane tuning shop. Skylines, Supras, drift cars, or luxury cars, Tommy Kaira took the world's greatest automobiles and made them even faster. And in the process, went from two dudes importing old Mercedes to one of Japan's most famous tuner brands. But when making just parts for cars wasn't enough, they set out on a journey to build their own supercar, the Tommy Kaira ZZ. That is, until that plan came to a crashing halt, and Tommy Kaira ended up in a legal battle that put their entire reputation in jeopardy. But to understand how they went from a 90s superstar to a forgotten icon, we need to go back to the origin of that name. Tommy Kaira. The first of those names belongs to Yoshikazu Tomita. Tomita-san was a car salesman in 1980s Japan. Japan's car culture was booming. Circuit racing and time trials were taking the nation by storm. But there was another market that Tomita was interested in. Imports. But not the imports that you're probably thinking of. That's right, while we've fetishized JDM cars our whole lives, Tomita-san realized that Japan was fiending for European cars. And so, Tomita, at the ripe age of 20, started importing fast BMWs and Mercedes-Benzes, even the occasional Lamborghini, and sold them to the elite of Japan. Now, the second name on the list is Kikuo Kaira. He wasn't a businessman like Tomita. He was a nerd. His working life started as a mechanic, graduated to working on race cars, and eventually found his way into some seat time in a few track cars. He worked at a shop called Racing Quarterly, a performance shop created by a Japanese dude and an American dude, whose goal was to bring NASCAR-style racing to Japan. Now, I'm skipping over a lot here, but the important piece of knowledge is that they formed a pro racing team at RQ, one that would land a corporate sponsorship from Esso, becoming the official Esso racing team. Yes, that team. And Kikuo Kaira had become the chief engineer of that racing team. He helped them develop the Augusta Mark II, a single-seater race car that would later see success at the Japanese Formula Junior series. Kaira was a genuinely gifted engineer, and as he continued racking up accomplishments, a lot of people came knocking with job offers. He worked with Tom Walkinshaw Racing and built a March 752 to race in European Formula 2. He built the legendary Kazuyoshi Hoshino's BMW race car and the famous Kojima Engineering KE007. Yeah, your boy Kaira was there for that too. The Toyota 83C, 84C, just check the roster. My boy Kaira was playing 48 minutes. But his big break came in 1983 when he was appointed chief engineer at Dome. Now, if you know anything about JDM cars, you know Dome. And guess who the founder of Dome was friends with? Yoshikazu Tomita. And it didn't take long before Tomita and Kaira crossed paths. Tomita ended up joining the Dome racing team to help the team get set up for Le Mans, and as he hung around the team, he realized that the real whiz kid was actually Kaira. So in the late 1980s, they teamed up and started their own venture. It was called, please tell me you got it by now, Tommy Kaira. And they had a singular mission: to build the best sports car in the world. And their logo, to represent the mission of perfecting sports car engineering, a turtle. Maybe it symbolized wisdom, or maybe the long path it took them to get there, or maybe just the tortoise beats the hare. The only thing I know for certain was, if you saw that turtle badge on a GTR, one, you probably couldn't afford it, and two, it was probably pretty damn fast. Kinda just like Bob's car. Who's Bob? Well, I'll just let Tim Diesel tell you.
This is Bob, and this is Bob's 10-second car. Bob doesn't have the best luck with cars, but lucky for him, he has My Carly. You probably think diagnosing a car looks like this, but with My Carly, it's easy. My Carly can easily read and clear fault codes so you can diagnose your ride before you hit the streets.
That's why she's spitting.
And with Smart Mechanic, you can get tips and info from the professionals, so you're never left guessing what's wrong. My Carly can also activate features with its coding functionality and show you live data so you can keep track of exactly what's going on under the hood.
Now this is the 10-second car.
So hit the link in the description to join the My Carly family.
And take control of your ride.
Anyways, first we need to figure out how Tommy Kaira built up their reputation in the first place. The plan was simple. They were going to build cars for customers and use the knowledge and profit from those builds to plan out the perfect car from scratch. Their original plan was to buy and build one of Nissan's Skyline R31, but Nissan's development was delayed and Tommy Kaira didn't want to wait around. So Tomita decided they should build what he knew best, a car that jump-started his career and about as far from a Nissan Skyline as it gets, the Mercedes-Benz 190E, which we're doing a video on soon, so please subscribe if you want to see that. It would be the first official Tommy Kaira built car, and it was called the M19. It was a standard 190E, but with a full custom body kit, bumpers, a decklet spoiler, newly designed wheels, suspension upgrades, custom taillights, and of course a custom exhaust. And as for the engine, it was the factory 2-liter, modified with high compression pistons and a new camshaft that pushed numbers to 150 horsepower at 6,000 RPM. And once the M19 was developed, they announced that they would also be putting their touches on the Mercedes-Benz 300E as well. The Tommy Kaira version was called the M30E. I think you can see the naming pattern here. And well, I wish I could tell you more about the M30, but to be honest, Tommy Kaira ran out of budget for development, and supposedly there's only 1 or 2 prototypes in existence. You see, 1.5 cars into this grand plan, and it turned out things just weren't working for Tommy Kaira. Their goal was to build their own car in their home of Japan, and modifying Euro cars was clearly not the best path forward, so they pivoted and said, to hell with the Euro trash, let's stick to our roots. Lucky for them, Nissan had just finished the R31 Skyline, which meant that it was now time for the very first JDM Tommy Kaira. They would call it the M30, which is very confusing considering the last car was the M30E, but whatever. This car would begin as a Skyline GTSR, and after a slew of upgrades, well, it still kind of looked like a GTSR. Same bumpers, same spoilers, same color options, same seats, basically the same interior, but take a look under the hood, and then you'd see where the money was spent. The standard Skyline came with an RB20 DETR, and at the time, it was the best engine that Nissan made, and well, Tommy Kaira ripped its heart out. In its place, they put the bottom end from an RB30, the same 3-liter straight 6 that our favorite Aussies still swap into cars today, and then they slapped the RB20 head onto it. That formula would end up creating an engine that made 276 brake horsepower naturally aspirated. Those were numbers that turbo engines were hardly hitting in that era, but sadly, you probably will only ever see one in Gran Turismo 2, because only about 200 were made and Lord knows how many are still on the road. But beyond all that, the M30 was the car that separated Tommy Kaira from the likes of other tuning houses in Japan, because it became the first tuned car sold in Japan, as in it was sold not as a Nissan, as a Tommy Kaira manufactured car. Much like how Albon Mercs is bespoke as well. Hand-drawn, made and shipped in-house, but unlike a Tommy Kaira, easy to get at the link below. Anyways, with the M30, the Tommy Kaira brand took off, and the idea of building their own sports car didn't seem so unrealistic anymore. But there was still more research to do, so they developed the M18SI and M20SI, or as we know them, modified Nissan Silvias. And once the Silvias were developed and sold, Tommy Kaira shifted once again to luxury cars from Nissan, a Nissan Sima to be exact. Now, we didn't get the Sima in the US, so in case you're unfamiliar, the Sima was like Nissan's Toyota Crown. Oh, right, we didn't get the Crown either. It was basically like a Lexus LS. But different. Same but different. That same year, Tommy Kaira also announced the new M20 and M30 series, now using the R32 generation Skyline instead of the R31. Now, the M20 was whatever, but the full-fat M30 was the business. A high-revving 3-liter RB making 280 horsepower at the wheels, full body kit, forged 3-piece wheels, along with basically every other part in the Tommy Kaira catalog. And once again, they made 200 of them for a few very lucky customers to the tune of nearly 7 million yen. Now, for reference, a brand new Skyline GTR at the time cost 4.5 million yen. It was expensive, but they were selling them, and Tommy Kaira was slowly building a real name for themselves. But their development wasn't done yet. The M30Z was a Z32 Fairlady with 350 horsepower out of a TTV6, and that car wasn't just about power. Tommy Kaira tuned everything down from the throttle response to the suspension geometry, and the result was a Nissan Z that was faster than the newest 911 Turbo at the time. After that, they decided to get back into Skylines, but this time it only made sense to modify the GTR trim. They called it the Tommy Kaira R. Not the most creative, but hell, at least it didn't have an M in the name. And it was given the same routine. Custom wide body, bumpers, interior pieces, custom wheels. The factory RB26 was tuned up to 350 horsepower, and it had a 7 million yen price tag. But as much of a surprise as it may be to modern JDM fanboys, the world was shifting to a point where nobody wanted to pay a mortgage amount of money for a hopped up Nissan. Development costs were growing to such a point on these insane builds that selling 100 or 200 of them just wasn't making Tommy Kaira any money. So Tomita and Kaira sat down and decided that maybe it was time to finally realize that original dream of theirs. Building the ultimate car born not from another platform, but built from scratch by Tommy Kaira. So in 1992, they began development of exactly that. But guess what? Building a new car is expensive. Go figure. In Japan, just getting a car to meet stringent standards and getting certifications was as expensive as building the dang thing. So Tomita went looking for a loophole. And what he found was that it was much easier to make the car somewhere else and then import it to Japan. He had years of experience importing cars, and his company already had a UK office, and well, I think you can see where we're headed here. So the plan was hatched, and the first step for this new car was design. For that, they commissioned the great Takuya Yura from Mooncraft to design a concept car. And if you saw our video on the Mazda 787B, then you'll know who Mooncraft was. Their design language was simple, very Japanese and very 90s. The headlights, friendly and inviting. The roof, inspired by a turtle shell, because why not? And that roof could be removed with just 4 bolts, making the driver experience all that much better. And as for the beating heart, well, I think you can guess which brand they went to. The Nissan SR20 DE was chosen, but they ripped out the fuel injection system and converted it to carburetors and ITBs. An odd choice, but this was the early 90s, and Tommy Kaira felt that they could maximize the driving experience with the sound and response of carbs versus those early fuel injection systems. So once the design and engine were mapped out, the plans were sent to the UK division of Tomita Auto, and they began building the car. The final product would be called the ZZ, and it was engineered to be as raw as sports cars get. Toggle switches everywhere, exposed metal, barely street legal, and that Carby SR20 made 180 horsepower and around 140 pound-feet of torque, which, before you laugh, was pushing a curb weight of just 1,433 pounds. This thing made Miatas look like Hummers, and thanks to that curb weight, it did 0 to 60 in 4 seconds flat. All of this could be had for about 5 million yen at the time, which was an absolute bargain compared to the fancy Nissans they were selling before. Plus, if you were crazy enough to think you needed more power, then you could just order the ZZS model for the final production year, which was exactly the same thing but tuned up to 197 horsepower. It was honestly one of the coolest driver's cars out there, and probably the coolest JDM car from the 90s, if you can even call it JDM. From 1996 to 2000, they built 220 of them, which is cool, but like, wasn't the whole idea to build more cars than last time and make more money? It was, but turns out there was this little thing going on called an economic crisis. Japan, like other parts of the world, was seeing a recession in the early 2000s. Because of that, exporting goods to Japan was just way too expensive. So that entire plan, the entire UK operation that was designed to save money, kind of fell apart. And to add insult to injury, safety standards had just changed. Japan was no longer using European rules and had adopted US standards for safety and crash regulations, which meant that overnight, small cars were no longer exempt from head-on collision safety standards. And so Tommy Kaira was basically left with a stockpile of worthless metal in the shape of ZZs. It was too much for Tommy Kaira, and the UK branch was eventually dissolved. The Tommy Kaira ZZ was dead. And as a last-ditch effort to recoup costs, the ZZ design and rights were sold off to a UK company, Breckland Technology. Tommy Kaira Japan was forced to sell a portion of their company to the very popular Autobox brand just to keep them afloat. And just like that, with the turn of the century, Tommy Kaira, along with Japanese sports cars as a whole, were just to become a distant memory. But Tomita and Kaira still had some fight left in them. Sure, the Japanese auto industry was basically out of the sports car game, but people still owned sports cars and people still modified sports cars. And something I didn't mention was that while they were building the ZZ, they were still building customer cars too. And not just Nissans, they had the M20B, a built Subaru WRX making nearly 300 horsepower, and along with that, built STIs, Legacies, Foresters, plus of course the GTR was still being improved by Nissan, so the Tommy Kaira R was as well. Their R33 version made 425 horsepower and was built to dominate circuits with full custom suspension and aero. They also built a Stagia, the R34 Skyline, the R34 GTR, which, my friends, was the final boss of Tommy Kaira Rs. There were 3 models. The R was just the base model that made 375 horsepower. The RS was the mid-tier model tuned to 435 horsepower with upgraded turbos, new ECU, supporting mods. And then there was the RZ, the all-out, fully built 530 horsepower special. Those RZs started out life as V-Spec GTRs from Nissan and then got the full treatment from Tommy Kaira. And there are only 11 in existence. Now, OG Albon viewers will remember, we did a video back in the day on why you can't afford a GTR. And in that video, we talked about those expensive Z-Tunes and M-Spec Nears. Back then, we couldn't find figures on Tommy Kaira GTRs. But since then, there's been some news. Craft Sports has a Tommy Kaira R listed for 1.9 million US dollars. Yeah, it's crazy. I don't know what to tell you. But the best part is, this isn't even the most sought after Tommy Kaira because, well, after Autobox bought a stake in the Tommy Kaira brand, Autobox went ahead with developing a ZZ2 with full support from Kaira-san and Tomita-san. They rebranded it under the Autobox name and called it the RS01, and it used the RB26 from the GTR, and the spec sheet looked absolutely delicious. 542 horsepower, 2,600 pounds, aluminum chassis, carbon fiber body parts, a Getrag 6-speed, a Tessa all-wheel drive, basically everything from a GTR but better and in a smaller and lighter package. And well, nothing else ever happened. It never made it to production, and well, you'll only ever see one in Gran Turismo because there's just one of them. Yes, just one. And it sits on permanent display at a showroom in Kyoto. And so, Tommy Kaira soldiered on. They weren't able to meet their goal of being the super sports car manufacturer that they had initially aimed to be, but at least they had a strong business souping up cars for their Japanese clientele. But, well, sadly, things were gonna get worse. A lot worse. In 2008, during the economic crisis, Tommy Kaira partnered with an aftermarket company called Rowan. They struck a deal for Rowan to use the Tommy Kaira name to market new parts that Rowan would bring to market. The condition was that all those products had to get the Tommy Kaira stamp of approval first before Rowan could send them. And not too long after signing that agreement, brand new parts were showing up on the market with a modified version of the Tommy Kaira logo stamped on it, but without Tommy Kaira ever knowing about it. It seemed like Rowan had jumped the gun and just started using Tommy Kaira's name on basically everything. Tommy Kaira, understandably, was pissed. Some of these parts were absolute garbage, and Rowan refused to communicate with Tommy Kaira about anything. So Tommy Kaira took Rowan to court. But even through the entire court process, Rowan was still making and selling Tommy Kaira branded parts, and that resulted in subpar parts flooding the aftermarket. And it was us, the JDM enthusiasts, who had to decipher fake versus real Tommy Kaira parts. Eventually, Tommy Kaira won that legal battle, but at the cost of their brand name basically being tarnished. Tommy Kaira, through all these years, had one thing, and that was their quality and attention to detail. And this one deal basically squandered all of the consumer trust they had built over the last 20 years. It really seemed like this was the final nail in the coffin for our friends Tommy and Kaira. But just like the humble turtle, they were gonna stick it out, no matter how long it took or how difficult it would be. A couple of years later, in 2010, a group of graduates from Kyoto University founded an electric car company, Green Lord Motors. Their goal was to be the electric sports car supplier of Japan, and they went to Tommy Kaira for help in developing this EV sports car. The result was the Tommy Kaira EV, aka the Tommy Kaira ZZ GLM. It made 305 horsepower and hit 0 to 60 in 3.9 seconds. Very respectable numbers, especially considering the car only weighed 1,800 pounds. And they built 205 of them. I was actually lucky enough to get up close and personal with one in 2016 at a Super Auto Box in Tokyo. And while it obviously wasn't a commercial success, it showed that Tommy Kaira was still focused on developing into the future. And since then, Tommy Kaira has continued to innovate, developing and selling performance parts, consulting with boutique sports car makers to build engaging cars to a high standard. But I can't help but feel a little bit sad. Tommy Kaira, like so many of the other JDM tuning houses of the era, is just another story of what could have been. Brands that were superstars of Japan in the 90s, who built those amazing cars and those grainy streetfire.net videos that we just couldn't stop lusting after, but they just couldn't survive the rocky waters of the new millennium. But maybe the fact that to this day, when I think of the most iconic JDM cars, I still see that cursive Tommy Kaira script in my head means that, well, perhaps the turtle really does win the race in the end. Thanks for watching. Subscribe to the channel, you filthy animals. Join us on Discord to hear about the latest mechanical surgery that Chris is doing to his Toyota Matrix. I'll see you in the next one.